Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar on the Nonprofit Business Model Foundation Funding. I'm Amanda Nelson, Director of Engagement at Nonprofit Financial Commons. It's our pleasure to have you all here with us today. Before we proceed, I want to share a message from our generous sponsor, Blackbaud. Blackbaud is the world's leading cloud software company powering social good. They serve nonprofits, educational institutions, local governments, and other groups across the sector by providing solutions designed for the needs of non-commercial organizations. Blackbaud's fund accounting solution, Financial Edge NXT, was purpose-built for the complex accounting and reporting needs of the social goods sector. Whether your organization is primarily funded by grants, program service revenue, or fundraising efforts, Financial Edge NXT has the features you need to increase accountability, make data-driven decisions, and ensure compliance. You can contact FinTech marketing team at blackbaud.com for more information. And I'd like to take a minute to introduce our webinar moderators for today, Wade Rogers and Mark Hager, who will be assisting us in facilitating an engaging and interactive experience. These moderators are individuals with deep expertise in the nonprofit sector, and they will be monitoring the questions and discussions in the chat section and sharing those with the panelists during the Q&A section of the webinar. So please feel free to actively engage with them and your fellow nonprofit participants in the chat section. During this session, we will be guided by a remarkable panel of practitioners who will help us understand the nuances of the foundation funding business model. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Hilda, who will guide us through an enlightening session on the opportunities and challenges associated with foundation funding. Thank you, Hilda.
Thank you, Amanda, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to have you this afternoon as part of our series with respect to various funding models. Today, the foundation funding is our focus. I am the market managing partner with BDO, and I have with me Dana Brito, who is going to also be a part of the conversation. Dana is a consultant to nonprofits and foundations, and we both look forward to being with you today. Let me begin by asking you, who is in our audience today, a little bit more information about who you are, what your organization's budget size and focus is. So let me start with this first question. And this way we all know who is in this virtual room with us. And that first poll is around organizational budget size. What is your expense budget as of this current year? And Amanda has launched the poll. Would appreciate if you would respond to give us a sense again as to who is joining us today. And Amanda, when you feel like we have critical mass in the responses, please publish the poll. That would be great. We can all see the responses. Are we good, Amanda?
Yes,
okay.
It's slowed down. There you go.
So it looks like we have quite a spread from 20% being under 250 to almost 20% being over 5 million and everything in between. So thank you. We realize that budget size brings a certain perspective, and hoping that foundation funding may be a source to increase that number. And so on my next question that we'd like you to share with us is your organization's mission area. And this is a pretty exhaustive list that we at the Financial Commons have compiled. And if you've been at prior sessions, you know we always ask this question, and we'd like to understand which mission area is really interested in a particular funding model, today being foundations. So please go ahead and respond by sharing your particular mission area. Okay, let me know, Amanda, when you think it's time to share.
Yep. Here we go.
Okay, so we can see here we have pretty much representation across almost every mission area that we have indicated. And I think this is in fact representing the fact that foundations are a source of revenue for so many mission areas. So again, you can see from arts and culture, community development, social service, education and youth, pretty much across the spectrum of who has joined us today. And then lastly, want to have a perspective on what role foundation funding plays at your organization. You probably need just an extra minute to think about this. Does foundation funding cover your general operating expenses, meaning it tends to be unrestricted in nature? Does it provide capacity building opportunities through the funding? Is it a seed money for new projects or initiatives? And in fact, more than one of these may apply. Does it fund programmatic activities and program delivery? So it's specific to a particular programmatic area. Does it fill gaps, planned or unplanned? This means, are you maybe heavy government funded and the unrestricted nature of the foundation helps you fill that funding gap? Or is it unrestricted in nature and therefore the overall budget is balanced because you have that foundation funding? And then lastly, does it support facilities and capital improvements? Is that what foundation funding has been able to do for you? Again, this is a little bit more complex in the nature of the question, and want to give you just a couple extra seconds to respond. And this will give us an interesting perspective as to the role that foundation funding plays. We have a significant number of participants today across, as we saw, significant areas of mission. And so this will be interesting to see just strategically how foundation funding is invested. Are we okay, Amanda? Just a little longer?
Yes, it is sharing. The
Okay,
resolution.
great. And so largest responses went to funding program activities and program delivery. And interestingly, you'll hear a little bit later in the program this fact that nonprofits are often funded by foundations for specific areas, restricted funding for that area. So this confirms that most of you are seeing restricted funding for programmatic activities, and then general operating expenses being the second, and then a few in the other areas. So again, this is about the match between the needs of the organization and the interest areas of the foundations that come in different shapes and forms, as we would learn today. So thank you again for participating. That was very helpful for me and for the individual panelists that are with us. So here's today's agenda. We are going to start with perspectives from the nonprofit news sector. We have a representative with us from the sector, who Emily Roseman, who I'll introduce in a little bit, and she will talk about the impact of the foundation funding in that particular sector. We'll have just a brief time for questions from you to Emily about her presentation with respect to the foundation impact in that sector. Then move to this bigger perspective of the world of foundations. How many different types of foundations are they? What is the impact that they have in the sector as a whole? We'll then move into the business model considerations, as we have in prior webinars with each of the funding models that we've explored, what to keep in mind and what capabilities to build if foundation funding is on your future. We'll have some time for Q&A with respect to questions around the world of foundations, as well as the business model considerations. And then I'll have the opportunity to have a conversation with a senior member of the Block Club of Chicago and talk about their experience in working with foundations as a major funding source. Again, lots of Q&A today. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions, and we have Wade with us, who is going to facilitate those questions, and then we have resources and wrap up. So that is our plan. Let me introduce you now to Emily Roseman, Research Director and Editor of the Institute for Nonprofit News. Emily, welcome. And I'm going to pass the virtual baton to you.
Thank you so much, Hilda. And I'm just so honored to be invited into your community. Thanks so much for bringing me here today. My name's Emily Roseman, and I'm the research director for a nonprofit called the Institute for Nonprofit News, also called INN. And we are a network of over 400 different nonprofit news organizations, including Block Club Chicago, which you'll hear more from later. And our organization serves to support and connect these independent news organizations with each other. And just to give you a quick example, I'm based in the Washington, D.C. area, so some of my favorite local INN members are groups like DCist, which is the digital first nonprofit outlet that provides reporting on the local DC coverage, and also Street Sense Media is a nonprofit news outlet providing coverage on the unhoused community in DC. So I'm sure many of you have crossed paths with some of our members' work before. One thing that INN provides is we are tracking and measuring the sector as it is growing. So I'll just jump to the next slide to kind of demonstrate some of the growth we're seeing across the nonprofit news sector has really started to take off in the last few years, as you can see here. This is a chart demonstrating the growth in the number of outlets that have launched in the last several years. And back in 2009, what the field really looked like was a collection of mostly larger national and global nonprofit outlets. Think big investigative reporting powerhouses like ProPublica or Center for Public Integrity. These groups were largely, much of their growth was supported in the early days by foundation funding, mostly foundations at the national and global level that were recognizing as legacy media organizations were being forced to drop their investigative journalism teams. Foundations were stepping up to support this market failure in journalism to make sure these entities could provide this service for us. One of, Ruth McCambridge, who is a financial commons expert, I'm sure many of you know, was one of the first people to notice this trend and document it in her reporting. Several years after, the field started to shift, and that's largely because the needs of our sector started to become more clear and more well documented, where there was a crisis in local journalism and local high quality reporting. So more and more hyper local and statewide reporting outlets were launching. Some of those outlets were launching in communities where there really aren't many commercial opportunities available. And so in those communities, foundation funding played a critical role getting those outlets off the ground. So what we're seeing now today, just to give you a sense of the current picture in 2023, about half of our membership are these local organizations, often startups or kind of newer, and the other half are kind of these more established larger organizations, a mix of investigative or really big state house producing entities. And what we're seeing is that foundation funding plays a distinct role in both of these sort of journalism models. And the way our field has started to talk about foundation funding's role for these models has varied over time. So for local organizations, foundation funding has really become kind of a startup investment. So when a local outlet is just launching, foundation funding plays a critical role in being there for the first 5 or so years to provide that runway, especially as the local outlet is getting a sense of the different revenue streams they can tap into in their community, like earned revenue or individual giving programs. For those national and global outlets, foundation funding is here to stay for the long haul, largely because those organizations are providing services like investigative reporting, where foundation funding is one of few revenue streams that can support this type of journalism that can sometimes get controversial. And the important thing that matters here is that these different types of news outlets are able to speak to their mission and speak to why they specifically need foundation funding, either to get started, to get off the ground, to provide that runway for experimentation and diversification, or to kind of act as a cornerstone support system for the long haul. And here's why. So I'll jump to the next slide here. And this slide just really hammers home that point. You can see these are the different revenue mixes we see in our data tracking our 400 members. On the far right, that is the revenue pie for our startup outlets. So these are news outlets in their first 3 years after launching. And you can see that 63% of their total revenue typically comes from foundations, and that's largely a mix of both national and global, but also local and community foundation funding. And as outlets tend to move along in their growth, many are able to diversify their revenue streams and start bringing in more funding from small dollar donors or major donors, which we lump under this individual giving category, but also earned revenue, including advertising, sponsorship, and underwriting. The other point I just want to make it on this slide before moving on is that there's a lot of what we hear from our work as an intermediary between the members we support and the foundations that fund our sector is coming in with a sense of your revenue model, both current and projected, is so incredibly important to foundations and funders when you're first making those pitches. And so, INN is a source of this benchmarking data for nonprofit journalism. I know there's a few other sources of benchmarking data for different sectors. I'll just shout out M&R is an organization that produces some benchmarking across different nonprofit sectors, including arts and some of the other topics we asked about in the poll. So I'd encourage folks, even if you're just getting started, it's helpful to come in with some early data just to give your funder a sense of like, this is what we think our revenue mix will look like in years 1 to 3, but here's where we're hoping we can move and diversify, or here's why we actually do need your funding consistently over the long haul. That is a very effective tactic we've seen many of our members employ with their funders. And then finally, another point I wanted to emphasize that we're seeing emerge in our revenue data across our many members is how those revenue streams change and fluctuate for individual outlets each year. This can be pretty unpredictable, especially when you're first getting started and trying out different revenue streams. Just this past cycle between 2021 and 2022, we did see the majority of the members that we track, 60% were able to increase their total revenue year over year, which is a really promising sign. And we count that as growing by 10% or more revenue year over year. You can see that in this past year, foundation revenue was the most consistent source of funding for most of our outlets, where 58% of the outlets we track were able to grow their foundation funding year over year. About a quarter did see decreases, whereas individual giving revenue and earned revenue had slightly more volatile years, especially, and this is what I'm hearing across the nonprofit sector more broadly, individual giving in the last year seemed to be especially volatile from 2021 to 2022 for many members. And so just an important thing to keep in mind that in the same year where you might be growing foundation funding, you might have losses in a different revenue stream, and that is extremely normal and expected, but always helpful to bake in some room for kind of growth and loss in each revenue stream each year. So those were just some of the top level kind of foundation funding trends we've seen across nonprofit news in the last year. I'd encourage you to visit our website at inn.org for more information on our field and even more benchmarking data. But thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Emily. And now we would like to open up for questions. I know, Wade, you've been looking out for questions that may be coming up in the chat, and there were some advanced questions also. I will leave you and Emily to the platform of sharing some of the questions from the audience.
Great, thanks, Hilda, and thank you, Emily. I do have a few, not only from the advanced questions, but from the chat that's starting to light up. So it's great to see your activity. I think that some of the advanced questions were actually relating to coming from smaller or startup nonprofits that look at foundation funding as this daunting step that they're not ready for. And I think that you've illustrated here that in fact, there are quite a few types of startup and small organizations that the foundations are really stepping in to fund. I just wonder if you could comment additionally on that to kind of allay people's fears, I suppose, of approaching the foundation world for their great ideas.
Yeah, so I will say it was interesting seeing the poll results of the expense breakdowns across this group of attendees, because it largely mirrors the sorts of organizations that we support. We support many nonprofits in that 250K or less range. Some of them are startups, some of them are just smaller nonprofits that are just 3 reporters, and they only need to be 3 reporters to fulfill their mission in their community. I will say one thing we do see for those smaller organizations is they are the ones who are tending to target and having more success with local and community foundations, which I know is an extremely regional wealth access point. Some regions, depending on your work, or some topics, depending on your work, have more robust community and local foundations than others. But I would, just be sure that you're aware of those community and local foundations in your area, or be thinking about, if they're not in your geographic state or region that you're supporting, is there a way you can tap into, say, a larger community foundation, like maybe the Silicon Valley one, if there's a topic that you could align around with that foundation.
And thanks. That was actually a fabulous segue. In fact, you kind of helped answer the next question that came in, was looking at that breakdown, especially in this sector, with respect to the types of foundations, community or national, family foundations. It sounds like, in fact, there's that whole mix depending on the strategy of the funder.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Wade. So it might seem self-explanatory, but our larger outlets providing national coverage, most of their foundation funding is from national and global foundations. So and then for our local outlets providing local coverage, they're able, their missions most resonate with more foundations rooted in communities who are in touch with and can understand the power of local reporting. And so it really matters to think through, which foundations will resonate with your mission and your outlets, your organization's value proposition, and why, and to keep that in mind while you're pitching those folks.
Most definitely, that community level funding is so key. And I think this is just a quick one, and then we'll close it. The examples of earned revenue. This is how the chat can be very, very collaborative, because the question was kind of, what are some examples of earned revenue in these outlets? And others chimed in thinking advertising and paywalls for content. Are there any other sources that we might not be thinking of?
Yeah, so earned revenue is exciting for our industry because it's relatively underutilized. Most of our outlets, I'd say 90%, do not have a paywall. Their coverage is free for the taking and republishing. So earned revenue tends to look like advertisements on websites, advertisements within email newsletters, and then sponsorships and underwriting of events, journalism events. And we're seeing some organizations have really been able to tap into this as a major revenue stream over time, depending on your local business community.
Great. Thank you for answering that. I think that that does it. We really appreciate hearing from you, Emily.
Thank you so much, everyone. And yeah, feel free to share my contact information or reach out with additional questions anytime.
Thank you. Thank you, Wade, and thank you, Emily. And now that we've sort of listened to the various points about the impact in this one particular element within the nonprofit sector, we want to move to what is the world of foundations. This dialogue that we had with Wade and Emily touched upon the fact that there are different types of foundations with different areas of mission and focus. And I'd like to introduce Dana Brito, who is going to share some thoughts on this particular topic.
Thank you, Hilda. So as we've made reference to in Emily's presentation, I think even earlier in the conversation, and I think as many of us who are participating today and who are on this webinar can attest to, the world of foundations is extremely diverse, both in terms of structure, but certainly in terms of strategic focus, giving focus, governance. And so that's all to say that particularly in the realm of business models that really heavily rely on and have aspirations to generate foundation giving and revenue from foundations, it's really, really important to understand that there are different types of foundations and to really understand who you are working with and who you are trying to engage with in the context of generating and building foundation giving. And so we're going to walk you through the main types of foundations that you'll often encounter in the nonprofit universe. And hopefully that you can use that to help think through how to approach giving within your respective communities, within your respective mission areas, and within your respective goals. So the first type of foundation is an independent foundation. So typically, these are not governed by a specific benefactor or benefactor's family, but they do utilize endowments that are typically from an individual or from a group of individuals. And so, again, there's not as much of a family connection. However, with family foundations, for example, obviously that tie is pretty deep. And you'll usually see that tie being represented in the form of governance. So you'll typically, for a family foundation, it's funded from some type of family endowment. And usually you will see members or representatives of the family sitting on the board and really providing the voice and the legacy of the family, and using that to inform the strategies and the operations of the foundation going forward. The third type of foundation is our corporate foundation. So these are typically created from some type of corporate entity. They are created with funding from that corporate entity, but they exist as a separate legal entity typically. However, a lot of the goals, the priorities, the reputations are very highly tied to the corporation through which they are funded. So you'll see corporations who have foundations. So like an example being banks who have corporate foundations. Major corporate companies will also build foundations. So those foundations, while they are a legal entity, they're obviously very much tied to the reputation and clearly the resources of the corporation through which they are tied. So the fourth type of a foundation are international foundations. And when we say, and when we're talking about international foundations, we're talking about foundations that operate beyond the US and usually have some type of cross-border giving requirements or goals. And usually there's typically some legal and compliance and management implications to that. So again, any foundation that's really doing work beyond just the United States and is doing a lot of work and a lot of giving that crosses borders is what we're classifying as an international foundation. And then the final type of foundation is private operating foundation. So usually they have these types of foundations are delivering some type of programmatic work that is beyond just giving grants. So I think there's a lot of museums and zoos that operate as private foundations and do some type of programmatic activity that is funded by themselves. You might even encounter foundations such as scholarship foundations who deliver some type of youth development and cohort training and professional development, along with some type of limited scholarships. So one of the distinguishing factors of these foundations is that, again, although they may make some grants, there's some type of programmatic or service or mission area that they're delivering and contributing to beyond strictly just grant making. So just to give you a sense of the larger landscape of the nonprofit economy and where foundations are fitting in, what you're seeing on the screen today. So Emily just sort of walked us through really what the funding is looking like in the context of local news outlets. What you're seeing on the screen is a little bit more macro level in terms of the larger nonprofit economy. So what you're looking on the screen is it's basically the Nonprofit Quarterly has published, I believe, 3 editions of this. And the most recent and the one that you're seeing on the screen is the edition that was published in 2020 that really maps out the major sources of revenue in the nonprofit sector. And so you're seeing those bubbles at the top of the screen that are representative of those types of revenues. And then where those revenues are going, which are the circles at the body. So the service areas and the mission areas where that revenue is going. And so I think once you subtract out some of those larger buckets represented by program fees from private sources, which are primarily going to healthcare institutions and higher education institutions and universities, individual contributions are really representing at least the 3rd largest source of income across the sector. And then once you subtract out of the 265 billion that individual contribution represents, over 100 billion of that is actually going directly to religious congregations. So in terms of that remaining 160 billion, a huge portion of that is actually going through and being funneled through foundations. And so what you're not seeing on this screen is the fact that when this was done in 2009, as it relates to the revenue makeup of most nonprofits, individual contributions were upwards of over 20%. And now, doing this 11 years later, that percentage has deeply decreased to just about 13%. Where the inverse is happening on the foundation side. So foundations are actually representing larger portions of sector revenue in comparison to prior years. And that trend is further amplified on the next slide based on studies from Giving USA. So once again, once you subtract out any of those private fees or the federal or state municipal government funding that we were looking at on the prior slide, and if you're just looking really at the contributed revenue universe, yes, it is true that individual giving still represents just over 1/3 of that total contribution universe, but it's fallen below 70% of that universe for the 4th consecutive year, and especially in comparison to 30 years ago, when that percentage was upwards of 83%. Clearly, individual giving is, at least on a sector level and on a broader level, it feels like individual giving is becoming a large or a lesser portion of the overall contributed revenue pie. And I think Emily made some reference to the volatility of individual giving, particularly in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. But again, the inverse is happening on the foundation side. So foundation giving has grown for the past 11 consecutive years. And I think the reason for the flip in that trend, I think there could be many reasons. I think the concentration of wealth in the United States, the growth in the stock market through which many foundation endowments are invested, are probably 2 really big reasons, especially over the past 30 years, for that proportion of individual giving decreasing in comparison to the foundation giving. There's also a really big, deep trend across the sector of limited life foundations, or foundations that are sunsetting and are basically set up to essentially fully spend down their endowments and then cease to exist after that spend down is complete and after that's successful. But I think the reasons for the trend aside, I think there are major, massive implications for this, particularly as it relates to the whole cultivation process, and how we are resourcing and preparing for the cultivation of these resources. Because I think, particularly in the fundraising realm, a lot more activity and a lot more efforts are being rebalanced and shifting a little bit more towards the foundation end, in response to this trend, in comparison to individual givers, and local and individual givers. And again, that trend might differ for you depending on where you are, depending on the work that you do, and depending on the networks and the access to foundations that you have in your respective geography and in the context of your work. But I think there are, again, pretty big philosophical and also practical and managerial implications to the fact that, again, there does seem to be a shift of power from, more and more of the wealth is becoming concentrated. So what does that mean for our individual giving efforts and our success? And also, what does that mean as a sector? Are we becoming more democratic or not? And how do we think about that in the context of our own organizational values combined with our needs for financial resources as an organization? So I think, that, massive philosophical question aside, when we're talking about foundation giving and strategies and capacities necessary to make sure that we're doing it well and maintaining it over time, I think it's always important to take a step back and really think about value creation, specifically in the context of the nonprofit sector, and really being intentional about how it differs from the for-profit sector. Because of course, in the for-profit sector, it's relatively straightforward, relatively unidirectional in that you're using economic capital to invest and to build profits. In the nonprofit sector, it's obviously a bit more nuanced and not as clear cut, in that there's different types of capital that you need to make sure you are utilizing and generating, and different types of capital that feed into each other to create the societal value that you need to capture and utilize, particularly in the context of developing relationships and generating funds from foundations. So what you're seeing on the screen, and I'll walk you through all the components in a bit, is a framework developed out of the University of Geneva in October of 2021, really to help understand this concept of value capture and how it helps inform strategies for generating and cultivating relationships and revenues from foundations. So the first piece of capital is, again, pretty straightforward. It's that you're seeing at the bottom of the screen is economic capital. So really that's money, or anything that can be converted through money. So property, land, it's all of those, specific financial resources and very direct financial resources needed to fund the work. At the top of your screen, the other type of capital that becomes super critical, particularly in the context of foundation giving, is social capital. So it's really your relationships, your networks, and building those relationships and networks over time is a hugely important factor in making sure that you have access to the foundations that you need access to, and those foundations who ideally, as Emily said, most heavily resonate with your mission and your value capture. So that third type of capital that you're seeing on the screen is cultural capital. So in the context of nonprofits, you could consider this the knowledge, the expertise that are embodied through your staff, your board, your volunteers, to do the work that you do and the approach through which you do it, and through the values that embody your organization. And then the third type of capital that you're seeing is basically symbolic capital. So essentially that's your reputation. That's what you're known for. And arguably, and most typically, the more you're able to build the other three type of capitals, the more the more you're able to build that symbolic capital. So essentially, you have mechanisms in place, and ideally you have mechanisms in place to build all four of these types of capital, which then are utilized to generate and create societal value or mission impact, you can call that. And so in the nonprofit sector, and particularly when you think about the context of foundational giving, it's the capture of that societal value, and maintaining that societal value is super critical when you're thinking about generating relationships and maintaining relationships and building reputations with the foundations with which you would hopefully have access to and can work with. And in that way, it becomes hopefully a somewhat virtuous cycle, if you will. And I know, again, in the context of the Commons, a lot of our content is very much geared towards finance, finance people or finance leads, and understanding that your main and primary goal as it relates to this giving is making sure that you're managing and being good shepherds to the funding that is given from foundations, but from any other donors. But it's also critical to really understand the importance of making sure that you have resources and mechanisms to build these other type of capital, the social capital, the cultural capital, and then in turn, the symbolic capital, because all four of those things in combination are what create the societal value that hopefully can generate revenue in the form of relationships and grants from foundations. So again, it's really important, I think, to think about not just the economic capital that can be generated directly from foundations, but the different types of mechanisms and the mechanisms created to build this fuller, completer, more comprehensive capital picture to create the societal value, which then is captured and hopefully is used to generate additional sources of economic, cultural, social, and symbolic capital for your organization. So with that, I will hand it off to Hilda.
Thank you, Dana. And as I sort of listened to Dana's evolution to creating that capital, I want to bring you back to what does it mean to successfully manage the foundation funding. So we've been able to attract the interest of foundations. How do we focus on particularly the systems and elements of the business model that we need to have in place? And as with our prior webinars in the series, we think about the business model considerations in four ways. The first is who's paying for the dollars, and Dana's really walked us through that aspect as it relates to foundations, the different kinds of foundations, as did Emily in her first talking points. I will dive just a little bit more into what are the common risks, sensitivities, challenges of working with foundations as partners, talk a little bit about the leadership capacity, what kind of skills and leadership influence do we need to have within our team, and then lastly, some infrastructure needs. And I know that we in our work often hear leaders being part of conversations with their board, where a key strategy is we need to diversify our revenue. And you yourselves on the call may be part of these conversations with your own boards or your own leadership teams. And what I'd like for you to think about is if this is one of the priorities for you in the coming years to diversify from other sources of funding into any of the five we've been covering today being foundations, I would want you to think about particularly these 3 points of the risks, the leadership capacity and the infrastructure needs, and are you making the investments that you need to successfully attract, maintain, and grow foundation funding? And so the first element is this element of risks and challenges. And the 5 foundation types that Dana covered, she often referred back to the sort of motivators or the funders or where the source of revenue is coming from. And we know that those funders have priorities, and priorities sometimes shift. And so when we hear of foundations going through strategic planning, often those who have been in the development field fear that that means a shift in focus that may affect whether you still are a mission that remains a priority for the foundation. So that's a risk to be managed most well by staying on top of what the changes might be with that foundation. It requires an array of funders to maintain security and to maintain stability over time. And so there may be larger foundation grants, smaller, but typically knowing what the pie looks like is important, and how you want to grow that pie is the diversity within the categories of foundations. In terms of leadership capabilities, we really, last time we were together, we talked about government and some of the leadership capabilities there. Here with foundations, we really are talking about relationships, as Dana talked about with the capital design that she shared. We need to have leaders who are persuasive, influential, well-informed about the issues, able to present to foundations in that sort of both oral and written capabilities, and also being able to continuously update the funding landscape as foundations come in, and they sort of vary in their strategy, staying connected to those that are important to you and understanding that that variance. And then lastly, on the infrastructure needs, we saw in the original poll at the start of the session that over 40% of you are really receiving funding for programmatic purposes. Those tend to be restricted grants. And so we need to have the internal capabilities to track those grants, the partnership between the finance office, the development team, and the program team to match what we offered we would do to the foundation that funded us, what we're actually delivering, the programmatic side, and then financially, are we able to track those dollars? And so that sort of partnership between the three aspects of the organization becomes really important. And then building the internal capacity to continue to seek funding that prioritizes your mission. So back to Emily's points. So again, I would urge you to look at this slide as, how do I build my leadership capabilities and infrastructure needs if I plan to continue to seek funding from foundation sources? And here, I wanted to share with you some research that was done as part of a project we were involved in to recognize. Dana talked about the levels of funding from foundations in the sector as a whole. The reality of that foundation funding is that more than 3/4 of the foundation giving is project restricted. And so, confirmed by the poll results at the beginning, a significant amount of funding comes in restricted grants, and 2/3 of the largest foundations, and we've also seen this even with smaller family foundations, they tend to have a cap of indirect costs at no more than 20%. In the last couple of years, we have seen several foundations revisit their caps and increase those. But in general, there's a lot of work yet to be done on the idea of indirect cost caps that actually make foundation funding sometimes a bit more challenging when it comes to, are they really covering the full costs of what we're being asked to do? Again, the idea that we would all appreciate having one kind of funding, and that kind of funding is the funding at the organizational level, the unrestricted type of funding. There is a spectrum of grants that foundations can make, and I would like for you to sort of go on this journey with me in terms of 4 different ways that a grant can be structured. The first is this enterprise level, unrestricted, including grants for growth, infrastructure, general operating. Lots has been written in the sector, and I, of course, would support that this is the most important type of funding that an organization can seek. Based on the research that we saw on the prior slide and based on the survey, the poll results earlier, we know that that's not the primary way that foundations fund. Some do all unrestricted, but if you look across the universe of foundations, they often have the restricted funding. Now, what we see in general is that there's this tendency to assume that if it isn't organizational level, then it must be line item level. If it's a restricted grant, it must come with specific line item restrictions, including those caps on indirect cost that I mentioned. And so if it's unrestricted, if it's not unrestricted and it's restricted, then we automatically jump to this line item budget submission to the foundation. The foundation may automatically make a grant that is line item restricted. In our work in the last few years, we have identified and have actually seen shifts in foundation framing to this idea that these are not the only two types of grants that a foundation can issue. There is this in-between type of funding that we call flexible program funding, which is either at a program level or at a project level. They're both this idea that foundations oftentimes have trustees that limit where their investments can be. It must be in youth development or it must be in senior services, whatever that mission might be. And that limitation is in fact a restricted grant, but beyond the restriction of what program or what project, if you are able to speak to the outcomes of that project or that program, and you need a budget in order to be able to request the dollar amount, is this $100,000 or is this $1 million in the grant? Once you've established that, what are the goals for the program or the project, and you've negotiated a dollar amount for a set of outcomes, it is possible for grants to be structured with this restricted level, meaning it can only be used for this program or project, but flexible as to the line item. And so this gives leadership in the organization the ability to determine where do I need to spend those dollars. And yes, that $100,000 budget may have had line item assumptions to start, but in building this type of grant, the foundation is giving the leader of the organization the flexibility to invest it in what they see fit as long as those outcomes are being accomplished. So we share this with you to give you sort of a broader perspective on how to approach the final grant design with your funders. Again, we've spoken with both foundation program officers as well as leaders who have been able to make this shift. So long as you are able to manage and track with that infrastructure slide before, that you are spending the dollars in that program area, the leaders are left to determine how best to invest it. That to us is sort of a win-win for both the funder that has that restricted mission requirement and for the organization. So if we can't have unrestricted general operating, then that would be the next best thing. Of course, if there is no way to negotiate a grant as flexible program or project, then we are left with these cost-based project support grants that require the ability to be able to track and report back to the foundation, not only the outcomes, but the line item as well. And part of this conversation with the funder is about presenting your financial story and presenting the financial story in a way that is persuasive, that connects to your outcomes. There is certainly a group of funders that will often want to know the cost per outcome or the cost per activity. So we want to make sure that what we're proposing to do, we understand in the context of the cost and what that it relates to. We also want you to be able to explain past trends and insights into the future. And so a simple way to think about that is if you would like to apply for multi-year funding for your project or program, it's very difficult to apply for multi-year funding unless you have a multi-year plan. So as we think about, part of the challenges of foundation funding is the annual cycles. If you have an opportunity with a funder that's interested in your mission to explore a multi-year grant, I ask that you be prepared to tell your multi-year financial story and that you understand the drivers of your business model. And so what are the activities that you plan to carry out in the next few years? What are the costs of those activities? So basically, what are we doing and how much is it costing? That ability to understand, is it primarily in salaries? Is it primarily in a physical location? What are the drivers of that model, of that program? And in the last few years, we have seen a concerted effort to focus on things like equitable compensation practices, like really focusing on reducing turnover. And oftentimes an organization has prioritized that, but hasn't quantified it. So if there are strategic priorities that you have, whether it's a program specific or organizational, such as perhaps bringing equitable practices to compensation so that your staff salary ranges are in a certain window, knowing more than that, knowing exactly it will be a $300,000 investment over the next 2 years, that will increase the chances that a funder will invest in your priority. That's part of that financial story. And then lastly, we want you to present with confidence. Some organizations will say that they fear that accumulating reserves may be a reason why a foundation will not fund them. And on the flip side, we often want you to think about the fact that accumulating reserves means that you are going to be an organization that perhaps presents less risk to the foundation. So whatever position you're in terms of reserves or plans to accumulate them, present with confidence about where your financial picture is. Not apologetic if there is a reserve level you've been able to create. And at the same time, if you're not at a reserve level that you would like to, talk about the story, the plans that you have to get there. So these are some elements of that financial story. And most importantly, anyone who is working with foundations to explore potential funding, often that's the development team in a larger organization, whether it's the development team, the executive director, the lead of program, even board members that are involved in fundraising, this financial story framework needs to be shared by all members so that they can present the same framework to potential investors. So thank you for your time so far. And now I will ask Wade to come back on, and Dana is going to join me here as well to answer any questions that may have come during the last few minutes since Dana and I presented.
Well, there are no worries about the volume of questions. I'm still catching my breath from monitoring the chat. So let me dive right in. Is there a separate tracking, or I know there is in terms of the trends with contributions to donor advised funds, because that's become such a significant topic of conversation in terms of that growth?
Yeah, I would have to look. It'd be interesting to look at that, the picture of the NPQ nonprofit economy, and look at that number in 2009, because I'm pulling it back up. Donor advised funds was 15, a pretty sizable number at 15 billion in 2020. I imagine it was probably smaller in 2009. I would not be surprised, again, in the context of all of the other trends that we were seeing, if the trend that we're seeing is that number is going up. And I think there's a lot of implications particularly from a management perspective to donor advised funds, because of that wall that I think is not as necessarily present when you're thinking about contributions directly from a foundation. But I think to the question, I would say I don't have the specific data in front of me right now, but all signs indicate that number is trending up. How sustainable that trend is, I'm not entirely sure. I think there's a lot of factors, especially within the economy, that will impact that. But I think, again, community foundations and the context and who often utilize or have some type of donor advised structures within them, as long as those are an attractive vehicle for individual donors, you'll most likely continue to see that trend increase, especially in the context of the trend of concentrations of wealth that we were talking about in the context of all of this giving before.
Yeah, and Heather just chimed in the chat that really kind of that overarching question is, where do gifts to foundations and DAFs fall in the Giving USA statistics? If that's all involved in that individual giving bubble or not.
Yeah, I'd
Go
like
ahead,
to
Tony.
guess, I'm going to take a guess and say yes, that it is individual, because when that donation is made, it's a deduction to the individual who made it. It could sit in the community foundation or intermediary for some time before it actually is invested in the community. But it is at that moment when they make that donation that it becomes a contribution.
Hilda, one of the first things you talked about in your section were these risks. And with respect to our overall relationship with our foundation funders, one of those that, and this was actually an advanced question that came in, was talking about mission creep or mission drift that may occur as we sort of adapt ourselves to our funders. And another side of it too is certainly something I've seen that simply changes in personnel in a nonprofit. Or any kind of upheavals that way can have quite a big impact on that relationship. Do you have any kind of feedback on that in terms of managing that risk, not only internally with the organization, but in terms of how that is being portrayed to a foundation funder?
So in the example of shifts in turnover on the leadership side, the most successful transition plans I have seen begin by identifying the foundation and major donor relationships and really working on that transition, whether it be the exiting executive meeting with them and introducing the new team member, or at a minimum, strategically sharing those relationships with the new team members to help them in their next meetings. It is about relationships. I think you've heard this through different parts of the program. And there's also turnover at the foundation, which is less common, but also, so you want your relationship to be with your program officer, but also to have a sense as to the foundation as a whole and what other leaders may be there that you might want to get to know. So it's preserving that connection. That would be super helpful. The point I made about shifting priorities, that is something to proactively be aware of and hard to prepare for, but most foundations who are shifting tend to give some advance warning to organizations, not always, but often. So understanding when that is coming. And I'll say one last thing with funding cliffs, the 2 or 3 year grant commitments that we all celebrate tremendously when we receive. I would want us to all be thinking in year 2, what happens in year 4 if it's a 3-year grant, and not waiting till that last 3rd year. And I know that in some of the advanced questions, there were questions around, well, how do you become sustainable beyond the grant when that is a key funding source, and you know it's going to be over, and everyone wants you to be sustainable after the grant? It's something to start thinking about in year 1. How can you leverage that 3-year grant to build the capacity you may need to be able to seek resources from other foundations? A 3-year partnership is a gift in many ways.
Yeah, and there were several questions as well about capacity building grants and the trends in foundation giving with that respect, so that you're maybe getting away from that reliance over 2 or 3 years, but actually building the capacity to move beyond the grant. This was a clarification question as well about the indirect caps. You gave an example of some foundations may place a 20% cap on indirect costs. And the question from the participant was really, it's not based on looking at what your overall administrative costs are. It's really an arbitrary cap that they place on their funding. And I think that was just a clarification we wanted to get on that.
It is when I've asked foundation program officers, so why 18 or 15 or 17, whatever the number might be, often the answer is because that's just what it's been. And so I also have learned that even if a foundation is willing to remove the cap, and is willing to fund the actual indirect cost, organizations sometimes are not in a position to really articulate what that number is. So part of building the muscle for doing business with foundations is to fully understand that business model and understand what is your indirect cost rate. So that if you accept the cap of 20%, but your indirect cost rate is 25, that means that 5% is a need to fundraise from unrestricted resources, particularly for that project that's being funded by the foundation.
Thank you. And there were many, many more. And as Mark in the chat encouraged, the forums on the Commons website is a great place to take these questions that we don't necessarily get to in this webinar today. So thank you both.
Thank you. And I know there are resources that we have accumulated that Amanda is going to love to share with you a little bit later that will answer some of the questions or support some of the conversation. So now I'd like to invite Maple Walker-Lloyd, who is here with us. She's the Director of Development and Community Engagement for Block Club Chicago. And our goal here is to sort of get to know Maple a little bit more and access her wisdom as we think about successfully working with foundations. And so Maple, welcome. I'd love to just start by asking you, development is a tough area. What made you choose that as the area of focus for you in supporting the sector?
Yeah, it definitely is. And first and foremost, I just want to say hello to everyone and thanks so much for having me. But just to put a little context around the profession and how I got started. Prior to joining Block Club, I actually worked in philanthropy. I was at the MacArthur Foundation in their journalism and media program. And even though I wasn't making investment decisions, I was able to see and understand how important these investments were to the media ecosystem specifically. I also had a passion for local news, and over the past several years, we've seen how newspapers and news outlets have shuttered. And I personally believe in the mission of Block Club and what they stand for. And while I didn't have experience specifically in fundraising, I did have a leg up by working in philanthropy and knowing those expectations and guidelines that funders were looking for. So the opportunity presented itself for me to join Block Club, and so I did. They launched in 2018, and I joined a year later in 2019, and I've been at Block Club for the past 4 years.
Great. Thank you, Maple. And so let's just hear a little bit more about the mission of Block Club and how you see that sort of connecting to that foundation world.
Yeah, absolutely. So Block Club Chicago is a nonprofit, reader-supported, journalist-run newsroom, and we're dedicated to delivering reliable, nonpartisan, and essential coverage of Chicago's diverse neighborhoods. And so what makes Block Club so unique is that our reporters are embedded in the communities that they cover. So they don't parachute in once or twice to tell a story, but they are literally in those neighborhoods every single day building trust. And what's also interesting to note is that many of them live in the neighborhoods that they cover, and they also look like those who live in the neighborhoods that they cover too. And something else that I'd love to point out is oftentimes when you think of Chicago, mainstream media poses Chicago as oftentimes a violent place to live, especially in communities on the south and west sides. But with Block Club, we're focusing on the stories that matter the most to our readers, what businesses are opening and closing in the neighborhoods, and how neighborhoods or neighbors rather are helping other neighbors in the community. Block Club also has a freemium content model. And so what that means is most of our content is free to our readers. So all of our West Side, South and West Side coverage is free to our readers. Breaking news, public health, and election coverage is all free. We have 19,500 paid subscribers. They either pay $59 a year or $6 a month. And then we also have more than 110,000 people signed up to receive our free daily newsletter. And then we also have around 20,000 subscribers signed up to receive our neighborhood specific newsletters. And that totals to around 130,000 people that receive those newsletters.
And so to understand the funding mix, say a little bit more about how you're funded and how it came to be that you're funded this way.
Yeah, no problem. And I do just want to mention this really quick. I apologize if you guys hear any noise in the background. Literally about 20 minutes ago, a water main broke. So there is a ton of noise in the background. So I do apologize about that. But just to talk about a bit about our funding pie. So right up until 2022, Block Club was 70% reader funded. So most of our revenue actually came from our subscribers. And then about 30% of that revenue, or I'd probably say about 25% of that revenue came from philanthropic support. And then the remaining came from individual donations, advertising, and then merchandise. Now, if you're looking at this pie, within the past couple of years, that has changed drastically, which is kind of what we want to happen. We always want to have a diverse revenue stream. So now we're about 60% supported from grants. Now we receive about 30% of our revenue from subscriptions, and then the remaining comes from advertising, donations, and merchandise. Now, in a perfect world, we would want 25, 25, 25, and 25. But again, that's pretty much unrealistic. But the goal, again, is not to solely rely on one source of revenue.
And so as you've continued to grow, when you said grants, I assume most of those are from foundations.
Yes.
That when you've sort of made that shift, you I feel like you've talked about building the muscle both internally and externally. So can you say a little bit more about how participants in the call today may want to think about building that internal muscle to be able to be persuasive?
Yeah, so I always love talking about this. I think it's so incredibly important, and it's your value proposition. You know, just as a funder wants you to fit into their portfolio, I think that nonprofits should be doing the exact same thing and asking the exact same questions. So I think you would do yourself a disservice to yourself and your staff if you compromise. So you should be asking, do your missions and goals align with that potential funder? You know, you want this to be a mutually beneficial relationship. And I always tell people your value proposition is your value proposition, and you should never waver on that just to receive funding.
And so that's, again, that internal muscle. How have you found it to be helpful to stay relevant with those foundations, to at least you be the one that decides which one you'll pursue from an external perspective?
Yeah, I think it's an internal conversation that you really need to have with your team to make sure that everyone is on the same page, whether it's me, the person that is specifically going out to have these conversations with funders, or if it's with somebody else on the team, whether it's a reporter or, you know, someone else on your team who may not necessarily be making those decisions, but that may have an internal network or a partnership with someone else. So it's just so important to make sure everyone is on the same page about your goals and missions, especially when you are seeking that funding.
And so can you say more about your sort of recommendation that organizations network?
Yes.
And if we're not clear, we want you to network.
Yes. You know, sometimes or a lot of times nonprofits may have a really hard time accessing, you know, a funder. And I always tell people that you want to make sure that you have a presence when it comes to certain things. Yes, we all know that there are capacity and bandwidth issues. We all get it. There's a shortage, but it's so important to make sure you're at those trainings. It's so important to make sure you're at those conferences. These funders want to be able to put a face with the organization so they can say, hey, yeah, you know, I know so-and-so, I just saw them at this conference. And then it also gives you a leg up in that if you can't find or reach out by phone call or email and get a hold of these funders, 9 times out of 10, they're often at these conferences and training, so that presents another opportunity for you to have access. And even when you don't have access to them, we all have to remember they're inundated with emails and calls all of the time. So use your resources. There's probably a peer or someone that you know in your network that can loop you in the back door, that can make an introduction for you. I think it's nothing to reach out to a peer and say, hey, you know, I know you're getting an investment from this particular funder, and I'd love to just reach out or see if you can make an introduction to learn more about their work, which leads me into the other point. You also want to make sure that this is a relationship that you're building and fostering, not just reaching out to that funder to get an investment. And it's okay to be able to plant the seed now. A no now doesn't mean a no later. So definitely build that relationship and establish it and foster it and water it and make it grow. And maybe that could lead to funding later on down the line.
Thank you, Maple. And I want to close with one question that connects back to what we saw in the poll about restricted funding, what I said about 3/4 of the grants come in restricted funds. We know that the most appreciated funding is the unrestricted general funding. We also know that that's not going to be the case. What words of advice do you have for organizational leaders to be ready for responding to restricted funding that is in line with the overall goals and value proposition?
Yeah, so ideally everyone wants general operations, right? Everybody wants that kind of funding. But I think it's important to keep in mind that that is obviously not the reality, right? So when it comes to unrestricted support, I think it really depends on the needs of that specific organization. So do you need an investment to support your overhead costs? Is there a specific hire that you're trying to make, or is there a specific project that you need money for? And you know, something I just want to quickly note, I had noticed a question that came through on the chat earlier about disguising your general operations to seek project support. Do not do yourself a disservice. If you need general operating support, find an organization that offers the general operating support. Remember, this goes back to your value proposition and not wavering from one side to the other. Whatever your needs are, seek out the organization or that foundation that can provide that support to you. You don't want to waver, again, just to seek that funding. So if unrestricted support is all that you can get, at the end of the day, if there are specific strategies or projects or things that you need, see how that works for you internally, and if that is an option that you can pursue in terms of unrestricted support.
Yeah, I would just add there, understanding, begin with your core budget, right? And seek funding for programmatic activities that are in the core budget. The mission creep risk is that you end up agreeing to deliver programming that is not in your core plan. And now we're sort of in a strategic quandary. So thank you, Maple.
Yeah,
I really
of course.
appreciate those words of advice that you've shared. And we want to give participants a chance to highlight some of their questions. So Wade, we're back to you. What have you been seeing?
Well, not only in the chat, but in the advanced questions that came in. One thing, you know, there's so many of the same question that have come in, and it's really, how do you find these funders? What are tips you might have for folks that are getting started on this road in terms of researching foundations and finding, like Maple, you mentioned, you know, find one that perhaps you'll find general operating support through. Any advice on that in terms of just that search overall?
Yeah, absolutely. So there, I'm sure in your city or town, there are organizations very similar to yours. So you should be looking at who's supporting them. I think that's the biggest thing. And then doing your homework and specific research on like-minded organizations can pave the way for you to then do further internal research to say, is this a foundation that aligns with our missions and goals, and that we could probably pursue an opportunity to build a relationship. So looking at your network and your peers could be a good resource.
And
Yeah.
if I could add to that, the Foundation Center that is now part of Candid has the research tools to be able to help you from a national perspective as well as local understand which foundations are funding. So beyond the peers, as Maple suggested, that is also another helpful tool.
Also, you touched on it, Maple, as well, the networking and multiple questions as well that came in advance. How do I actually get in front of that program officer? I may see them at a conference or meet them but it's really almost like, how do I really get in to make that sales pitch?
I think it's pretty simple. You just walk up to yourself and you introduce them. But what I will say in terms of the pitch, I don't think being at a conference or specifically a training is a good opportunity to pitch. I think those are opportunities where people need to distinguish that is an opportunity to introduce yourself and who you work for. But that is not an opportunity to pitch a funder, because they're being inundated with so many people trying to do the same thing. So I think you need to set yourself apart, make your introduction, leave your card, ask for their card, and follow up after that training or conference.
How about after the fact? And this is a good one, because so many of my clients tend to be wary about actually going back to funders with questions. So if you are rejected for a grant, what about going back and really finding out why you had that rejection?
I think
something you've done.
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing, you're not going to win them all, right? And so I think my best piece of advice to this is to find out why you weren't selected in that round. And as I mentioned or briefly touched on before, a no now doesn't mean a no later. Maybe it was something that you didn't expand upon in your application. I know when we first started when I first started at Block Club, the co-founders could not figure out why they were not getting funding from a specific foundation. And so I reached out, asked if I could have a conversation, and it was really just a line of miscommunication. They wanted to know something specific, and it was not put in that grant application. And then so we made sure for the following round, we put it in the grant application so they would have a better understanding of our internal structure. And then we were awarded that grant. So I think it's important to really ask for feedback and see how you can attack it again the following round or the next year.
That's so helpful and so relevant to the questions I get so frequently as well. And that these came up as in fact on the advanced questions simply about that power dynamic. If you're a small startup, grassroots, BIPOC led, anywhere where you're feeling that you are dealing with sort of this position of power and kind of afraid to reach out or ask those questions, and really how to navigate those waters, which I think a lot of folks feel often wary about.
Wade, I would just quickly add, I know it's so hard running a nonprofit, right? And so it can be so discouraging sometimes, to say, man, I gave it my best shot and, it still didn't work out, but keep going and keep pursuing. You can do it. Just take all of those resources that you've been given, all of the guidelines, and it will work in your favor. It really will.
That's so great to hear, and I hope others are taking that to heart. And the last question that came as well, I thought that was interesting, was leveraging your social media with respect to your foundation funder relationships. If foundations in their maintaining relationships as well as funding decisions are looking in that area of your social media presence and what you're doing there and keeping them informed. Any tips on that?
Yeah, so we have a pretty big following on all of our social channels. So on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And we even, I think, recently launched on TikTok. And my biggest piece of advice is one, to stay active. And the content that you're essentially sharing on your news site or in your newsletter or in your print publication, that information should also be found on your social media. So it's literally just another streamline for folks to access your information, because not everybody's accessing your information in the same ways. So it's so good to remember whatever you have in your newsletter, whatever you have on your website, however folks can access the information, make sure they can also access it properly on social media.
Thanks. Thanks so much. I think that does it for this round. And I hope you get that water main fixed.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Wade, and thank you, Maple.